We'd probably talk about this stuff at the end.
What stuff?
The overclocked Toronto thing, and then the I think it was just that. Yeah, because we could
Okay.
talk about the phase thing, like the average age of teams. We could talk about that, like
Yeah.
as it comes up, really.
It's 1-1 in the grand finals of the AM thing too, so
All right.
it might be over by the time we get there.
Yeah.
All right. I think we sound all right on Twitch, but testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Twitch is good. YouTube, we're still talking about the amateur tournament. All right, YouTube sounds good. I sound good to you now?
Yep, sounds fun.
All right, let's do this.
Hello and welcome to episode 185 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about the biggest and best event of the calendar year, the 2025 Call of Duty League Championship. CHAMPS is almost here, starts later this week, and like I said on the last episode, I figured that we would give this podcast out a little bit earlier than we normally do our preview shows because this is the last event. I figured that this is going to be one of our longer shows, all previews are really for us because we tend to start ranting and raving about these teams, but there's a lot to talk about for this event, obviously, and we plan to talk about pretty much everything that we can going into this final tournament of the year. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Like you said, this is the big one. Champs preview finally here. Feels like it's been forever since we actually had some, pro COD to talk about. I know we were just talking the amateur tournaments going on right now that had a couple pro teams in it, but this break has definitely felt longer than it probably actually was. But Champs is here, and for those who aren't following the season super closely or whatever, it is not over. There still is the big one here coming up, and we do have a decent amount to talk about. I was looking at some of the matchups here though, and I was, admittedly, I was like thinking ahead of time, like, oh, I can go analytically into looking, like all the maps and stuff they played in each of their matchups and stuff, and there honestly wasn't as much, to look into for at least for the matchups that we know so far. So, I guess that can be a good or bad thing just because, it is Champs and anything can happen, as we saw last year and we've talked about in previous episodes, like FaZe, unexpectedly falling short of even making the finals last year, and then Optic going from last place at the final major to winning Champs. So, it's the big one. It's the one where you get your ring. It's the one where legacies are cemented. If you didn't listen to last episode where we talked all about legacies and what can be gained or lost from this event. So yeah, we got plenty to dive into.
I'm sure we'll get more granular as the show goes on, but I do kind of want to loop into those people that you were just mentioning, how maybe you were kind of tuned out the CDL or you don't really follow competitive COD all that much, and you might think, well, there haven't been any matches in a month. It's over probably. The season's done with, I'll come back in October and November. Nope, it is actually happening still. Champs is happening this week, so please tune in. But I do want to kind of update those people that maybe tuned out or just, didn't tune in the first place. So Champs is the biggest event of the year, as we've said, is the World Championship event. And in the CDL era, it is the playoffs, essentially, for the CDL regular season. The top 8 teams from the regular season standings qualified for this event. There's 12 teams in the CDL, so the bottom 4 teams, the Minnesota Rocker, who I'm representing with this t-shirt right now, Cloud9 New York, LAG, and Vegas Falcons. Those 4 teams did not make it to this event, and obviously are not competing at all. The top 8 teams, according to the CDL standings: number 1, LAT, the Thieves; 2, Atlanta FaZe; 3, Toronto Ultra; 4, Vancouver Surge, 5 Miami Heretics, 6 Carolina Royal Ravens, 7 Optic Texas, and 8 Boston Breach. So those 8 teams are slotted into a double elimination bracket. Throughout the season, there are majors. Those majors have 8 teams that start in the winners bracket and 4 teams that start in the losers bracket. Because there are only 8 teams at Champs, everybody starts in the winners bracket of this event. So everybody could theoretically screw up at least once and lose one match and still be able to win the championship, except the team that, potentially goes through the winners bracket and then loses in the grand finals, which is another argument for another day. But the top 8 teams are, as I just said, and they're matched up as you would imagine, 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7. So the bracket is as follows: LA Thieves versus Boston Breach, Vancouver Surge versus Miami Heretics, Atlanta FaZe versus Optic Texas, and the Toronto Ultra versus the Carolina Royal Ravens. So those are our 4 winner bracket round 1 matches. All 4 of those matches will start the first day of Champs. Those are the only 4 matches on the first day of Champs, which is Thursday. And matches start around 3 p.m. Eastern. It should probably go until at least 8 o'clock at night Eastern time zone, probably even later than that, depending on how matches go or if there are any technical difficulties. That kind of gets people up to speed. Now we'll actually start talking about these matches and giving our thoughts on them, because I think there are some really, quite interesting matchups. Some of them on paper do not seem to be very competitive, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I do want to start with probably, it might not be the most popular matchup because I think that'll be FaZe versus Optic, but I think this is one of the most intriguing matchups because of where they are coming out of the final major of the season, and that's Vancouver Surge versus the Miami Heretics. The Heretics have had this kind of late season resurgence. They had a great first event of the year. They placed top 3 very unexpectedly, and then had, I believe, a top 12 finish at Major 2, made a roster change, brought in Super, who has been transformative for Miami in all honesty. And he, along with Rancor, probably, in my opinion, and I think yours opinion as well, the top 2 Rookie of the Year candidates this season, along with Real, who we had such high hopes for coming into the season, and he's really done a great job continuing on with that. Miami finishes the season strong. They are, I believe, the only team to beat Atlanta FaZe and LA Thieves on land this season, with those 2 teams being the top 2 in the league. And they obviously finished top 3 at Major 4 as well to close out their season. The Vancouver Surge have like a similar path, right? Because they had a really, really rocky start to the season. They finished top 12, I believe, at Major 1. They make a roster change after Major 1, bring in Neptune, who neither of us were very much convinced that he was going to be anything more than, maybe he could get them to top 8, but it definitely did not seem to be a huge move that would swing any kind of success their way. We were totally unequivocally wrong. He turns into what we considered to be the comeback player of the year this year, a player that probably deserves MVP votes and to be an all-star in the CDL this season. They finished second at the Major 2 and Major 3, and then they just have this disaster-filled Major 4 performance where they finish top 12 and lose to, I believe, the Vegas Falcons, if I'm not mistaken. And the Vegas Falcons finished dead last in the CDL regular season standings. So where are you kind of looking with all of that context in there? What are you looking at with the Vancouver Surge versus Miami Heretics in round 1?
Yeah, I honestly, so this is what I kind of prefaced when we were just doing the intro. I honestly felt like these teams had played at least once recently. And I don't know if it's just, my mind playing tricks on me or whatever, but at least according to Breaking Point, Miami and Vancouver have only faced off twice this year, and the last time they played was on March 9th. Super joined the roster on a full-time basis on March 26th. So that means these 2 teams haven't faced each other with the new lineups, at least. And before that, or just this year, I guess Vancouver's 2-0. And I actually didn't look. I think one of those matches might have been in the Major 1 qualifiers. Yeah, one of them was in the Major One qualifier, so that means like even Neptune has only played once against Miami, and it wasn't this Miami team. So that was really surprising for me when I was just looking at it. I really felt like I feel like there was a matchup in there where I just feel like I talked about, like, Vancouver being the hard point team, Miami being the search team. Like, if one of those teams gets the edge in one of those other modes, it could lead to their path to victory, as long as that aforementioned team sticks to their mode and then steals one of the other team's good modes. So yeah, I'm kind of surprised, and that could, I don't necessarily, I do think Miami is favored in this matchup just based on recent performances, and it is, partially saying that because we just haven't seen these teams in action in a while, but specifically we haven't seen Vancouver in a while since they had their disastrous performance at Major Four, and that just has them as a bit of a question mark in my mind, like what Vancouver is going to show up to champs. And I just think, like, based on what we've seen from Miami lately, I got to give the edge to them, and especially with the search and destroy, even if this is a gritty, game 5 series that comes down to the wire, I got to give the edge to Miami there, just because of how good they've been in search and destroy since Super joined the team. But yeah, that was honestly the biggest shock when I was just doing the notes before we went live. Like, I can't believe these two teams haven't faced off since Super joined the team, and that does, I think, in terms of how exciting this matchup is, like, that, I think that adds a little extra to it, just because if these teams had played previously, you kind of have more of an idea of, like, the map pool, like what if one team has an advantage in a, like, just throwing it out there, if Vancouver is really good at rewind hardpoint, and Miami hasn't been as good at that, like, does that sneak in to the map set, or is that an instant veto, and et cetera. So from that perspective, they obviously have a ton of VOD, both teams do, on the other team, but not as much against one another to look back on and kind of reflect. So I do think that adds a little bit of intrigue to this first round matchup. If Vancouver comes out and plays like the Vancouver that we saw earlier this year when they made the change for Neptune and they made back-to-back major grand finals, this should be a really good matchup. And again, I could see it go in game 5 where Vancouver is winning the hard points, and then Miami maybe gets a Neslo in there. But talking about hard point, it's not like Miami is a slouch in hard point either. Like, they are a good hard point team. It's just they are a really good search team. So that makes Vancouver's job harder if Vancouver isn't able to win the hard points, which they have been relying on since they made the roster change. So that's how I'm really looking at how this series should shake up. I'm thinking Miami takes it, just based on, saying recent performances, even though it's a month ago, but that's all we got to go on. But I do think that the fact that we haven't seen these squads square up with these rosters makes it a little more interesting.
Yeah, I was just looking up what their like hard point records are, S&D records, and then I was just looking kind of at their schedule, and Miami's most recent losses were to, of course, Atlanta FaZe and LAT, the two grand finalists at Major 4. And then before that, they lost to the Toronto Ultra in April. They lost to LAT. They lost to Toronto. The last time that they lost to a non LAT, Toronto, or FaZe team was before Super even joined the team. So they have what, 4 or 5 losses since he joined, and all of them are to the top 3 teams at the end of the regular season, which kind of shows how they took care of business. Like, they're supposed to beat the teams that are below them, and they've been able to even beat some of the top teams. Like I said, LAT and FaZe, they have beaten on land this season, which really gives them an edge. Vancouver has not been certainly FaZe. They have beaten FaZe multiple times this season, and that kind of actually put them on the map post Neptune. That was their first match after he came into the lineup, and I think that really opened our eyes to, okay, maybe they should be taken a little more seriously. Of course, they go to the Major 2 and Major 3 Grand Finals. They don't have a lot of success there, even though I do think it was a lot closer in the actual maps than the final score would indicate. But yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, I was looking up their map scores, and like you said, Miami is probably the best or like second best S&D team since Super came in to their lineup. They're 18-6 since like the end of March when he was signed full time, and then they're 500 in hard point and control combined, a little bit over 500 in hard point, a little under 500 in control. But like you said, like they're not a bad hard point team, and they played some really hard teams in that time that probably skews the hard point record a little bit as well. Vancouver, though, is like a ridiculous hard point team since Neptune came in. 39-18 in hard point since mid-February, and then they're a little under 500 in S&D and a little under 500 in control. So it really is how you laid it out. Like if we're looking on paper about like what are the strengths of these two teams, you have a team that has a very notable and very obvious strength in hardpoint, and then you have another team that has a very notable and very obvious strength in search and destroy. Neither of them are particularly strong in control. Neither of them have like another game mode that they're like very adept at and have like a 60 plus win percentage in that game mode. So I think it could come down to who's going to win this control, who's going to be able to take control of, no pun intended, that map 3 and potentially swing the series, because it does seem pretty realistic that Vancouver wins map 1 of this series, Miami comes back in map 2, and then you're tied 1-1 going into the final 3 maps of the series. And I would lean toward Miami like you, and I'm going to end up picking Miami because it was very concerning to see Vancouver at the end of the season, not only Major 4, but the Major 4 qualifiers as well, because there was a reason that they started in the losers bracket of Major 4. Like there was a reason that they weren't able to, even have a chance to really play the top teams that they had been competing so strongly against in Major 2 and Major 3, and in the second minor as well when they went to the grand finals and played LAT. So I'm going to go with Miami. I think it's like I said on the legacy talk, how special it would be if Miami was able to win this event, which is of course like a long shot, even with how good they have been over the last few months. But this is an all Spanish roster team. This is, I think, the only all European team as well, because I think Toronto has Joe DeCeves, and there are a few other teams that have like half or close to a majority in the European players. But this is a really unique team, and I really look forward to seeing this match. I think both of us hope that Vancouver is a lot better than the last time we saw them, and Miami is still at the level that we last saw them, because if that is the case, that turns into probably one of the most thrilling matches, I think, because there's really not a very good edge for either one of these teams going into this match. Next up, I want to talk about one that probably isn't as competitive, LAT versus Boston, the 1 versus 8. But we should mention that Boston upset LA Thieves in the first round of the second major of this season. I think we had literally talked probably verbatim about how Boston has no chance to beat LAT in the first round of that tournament, and they come out and they upset them. Of course, LAT ends up bouncing back in Major 3 and Major 4, winning both of those events. Boston has struggled to find any sort of real consistency this season, but like we said many times during the season, making champs is an accomplishment for Boston. For that team that was by far the worst team in the entire league last year, for them to get here, that is a really big moment for their franchise. However, I think we're both going to pick LAT. What would you say is like the percentage that you would give Boston that they'll be able to pull off another upset against the Thieves at Champs?
I yeah, I mean,
Was it like 5% that they pulled off? Is it 2%?
I can't say 0%, right? Because it has happened this year, and that's really like where my thought process is. Um, with this matchup, like it's 2-2 on the year, which, you know, if I blindly had to guess, obviously I know that Boston has beaten Thieves this year, but I would not have like just blindly guessed that it was, you know, a 2-2 overall record. I again that was just one of these things I was doing the notes. I was like, wow, that doesn't seem right, but I guess at the end of the day, it does make sense. So yeah, back to your question. I mean, it's not 0% chance of Boston pulling off an upset. There has to be at least 1% chance. But just the way LAT have been playing over these last couple months, back to back major champions, I think in most people's eyes, the undisputed best team in the game right now. And if for whatever reason they aren't the best undefeated team or undisputed best team, they're like 1B to 1A. So really like it is kind of a dangerous situation to be in. I just in the sense of like if everybody, you know, if the majority of people are banking on Thieves or expecting Thieves to win this event, then like they only have stuff to lose, really. Like, you know, like the pressure's on, and you know, and yeah, at least some of these guys like Hydra and uh Envoy have been here before, have rings and have done it, so it's not totally unfamiliar or uncharted waters, unfamiliar territory, whatever. But yeah, I just think like the way LAT have been playing lately, you gotta heavily favor them in this matchup, but it is at the same time like this is kind of what I was thinking with Minnesota Rocker. This is going to be weird, maybe for some people who haven't listened to all the episodes and stuff. But my whole thing with the Rocker earlier this year, they were going through all those reps of forcing reverse sweeps and or forcing game fives and getting reverse sweeps, or they were forcing the game fives and then losing the game fives. But they were getting a ton of reps. They were going down 0-2 and they were fighting back. And I was saying like, you know, if this team gets to these situations later in the season, the early reps can pay dividends because they know they've been able to get to a game five. They know they've been able to pull off reverse sweeps. And obviously it didn't work out for Minnesota. They make roster changes and that narrative still continues, but they don't make champs. On a smaller scale, like Boston comes into this matchup, heavy underdogs in most people's eyes, but they know in the back of their heads it's they've had this squad since last year's EWC. They know they have beaten this team they're playing against multiple times since this roster's been together, and it's the same rosters on both sides, no changes. Like so they know they can do it. It's just going to be a matter of fact of putting the pieces together and actually making magic happen at champs. Like no other real way to say it. I don't think many people are expecting Boston to make that magic happen, but they have done it before, so it's not impossible. End of the day, I do think this is probably a 3-0 for LAT. Maybe Boston steals a map, but I would be very surprised if this goes to a game five, let alone if Boston wins.
Yeah, I believe Boston's best game mode is hard point, and they're not like a overwhelming favorite in that game mode against most teams, but particularly not going to be against LAT, which is, you know, the best, second best, third best. Like they're not escaping the top three in terms of top hard point teams. So it's going to be really difficult for Boston to pull that off. But I thought you brought up a great point, and that's these are two teams, two of the maybe four teams I think in the league that did not make a roster change at any point this season. And I believe Boston is only one of two teams in the entire league not to make a roster change after EWC last year, because LAT brought in this whole new roster. Obviously, we're, you know, that was a good move. We both agreed that they created a super team basically overnight with the signings that they made in the offseason and bringing in Scrap and bringing in Hydra and everything. But Boston has a ton of chemistry, and I don't think that can be understated. And I think it's really the key reason that they were able to make it to champs in the first place. They are not the most talented team in the world. No one is going to mistake that. You know, no one, like I think Snoopy has by far the most talent of these 4 players, but he has his flaws, as has been pointed out multiple times in multiple different places. These are, other than Snoopy though, they're all players that have been dropped multiple times. I think Purge's only been dropped technically once, but he was much maligned before he got dropped the one time with the Vegas Legion. But everybody else has been on multiple teams in the CDL, have been really doubted, and they've seemingly found something with Boston, not a championship contender, but a champs team, which is not something that I think a lot of people predicted for the Boston Breach this season. And so they've had so much time to practice with each other, not only over the last month, but they've been together for a full year now, it feels like. I'm trying to look up when Cammy and them came in. So they came in technically in July 22nd. So
I was say July.
So literally 11 months from today, they formed. They've been practicing. They've done some really incredible things, like we mentioned, beating LAT on LAN. They have pulled off a few upsets. They beat Optic Texas at the beginning of the season, which of course was more so like probably a harbinger of what was going to come with Optic rather than what happened with Boston. But they were still able to do that. They've, like you said, they forced a lot of game 5s. They've been able to be really competitive with a lot of these teams, even if they don't win. I hope that's the case here. Like I'm not going to root for either one of them. I think it would be an incredible story if the Boston Breach won, but I don't expect them to do that. I would just like it to be competitive. I don't want it to be like a LAT versus Carolina matchup where, it's a 25-minute match and we're just kind of moving on with our day after it. I would like Boston, even though they will get a second match, they will be able to kind of redeem themselves if they do get bounced really quickly. I would just like to see them have this kind of moment of like win a map or two against probably the best team or the second best team in the league at champs, and then go down the losers bracket, really try to make a run from there. But yeah, I'm going to be going with LAT. There's just I don't think anybody really should be picking Boston in this matchup. Another match that I think we're going to talk about, but I think it is not really competitive on paper with how these two teams have played at the end of the season. Toronto versus Carolina. Carolina at one point was probably the most surprising team in the league. You could argue it was Boston for a moment, because I think they were as high as like 6th in the league. And of course that was a team that finished last a season ago. But Carolina was a team that I thought would be in the bottom 4 pretty definitively at the beginning of the season. And instead they were in the top 4 in the league for a good stretch of this season. And they look to be probably not a championship contender, but certainly a team that could make it to the grand finals if things break right for them in a tournament, and certainly definitely finish top 3 or top 4 at really any event. They start to kind of downslide, I would say, with Vivid near the end. I know he was kind of criticized for his play and everything, and people said that he wasn't the greatest player or whatever, which, is kind of here nor there. But they were still getting the results they needed to stay in that top 4, top 5 range. They make that roster change, and they bring in Rex, and it just hasn't gone well at all. It is completely backfired to this point, I should say, because if it kind of clicks together at champs, then whatever happened at Major 3 with very little practice, or the Major 4 qualifiers, or at Major 4, none of that matters at all. So if they come to champs and they perform well, I'll eat all the crow and I'll shut up about it. But at this point, to what we've seen so far over the last 5, I guess it's been more than 5 weeks because there hasn't been matches in 4 to 5 weeks, but in the last 4 to 5 weeks of play of the regular season, what we saw from them is that they're probably not even of the champs teams, but of the entire league, they're one of the worst teams. They were definitively one of the 4 worst teams at the end of the season. So if they had played the way that if they played the rest of the season, the first 70% of the season, how they played to finish, they would not be going to champs this season, which I think speaks to how critical some of these players are, even if they don't put up stats. And that's not to say that Rex hasn't done his job, but it's kind of what I spoke to about Boston, but it's the opposite. Chemistry does matter. And breaking up a team, even if it is just replacing one player who you believe to be the underperforming player, or the player that you feel like needs to step it up the most, that one move can completely derail an otherwise promising season. So I would like to get your take on this, because um, you were very favorable to Carolina, and I don't say that as like accusatory or anything, but you believed that, you know, Carolina, and we talked about like their S&D in particular and how that could shape how this season goes. And I think we were both kind of on the fence about how this move was going to go with Rex. What have you seen so far, and how do you feel going into this matchup with the Toronto Ultra?
That's really that you can go back and look at all the episodes and whatever since the Rex move happened. I wrote it down. The Rex was either debuted or his roster announcement was April 16th. So it's still been just over 2 months since he joined the team. But whenever that happened, or the first reports happened, or whatever was going on, go back and listen to all what I was saying. Was my mentality, at least, like me thinking about the position Carolina was in at that time with Vivid. I said it was, does making the question you have to think, if you're, you know, in charge of Carolina Royal Ravens roster decisions or whatever at that time, the question was, does this roster move of bringing in Rex for Vivid give us a better chance to succeed at champs? If the answer was yes, then you make the move. If the answer was a no or I don't know, then you can stick with Vivid, because the position Carolina was in from their strong start was that it seemed like they were essentially a lock for champs. And the performance at the time of that move was starting to decline a little bit more than we saw previously. And it felt like they weren't, I think it was during the Major 3 qualifiers, it felt like they weren't going to do very well at Major 3, regardless of which roster showed up. And then I remember like they played LAT in their first 2 matches with Rex in the roster, and they struggled against LAT with Vivid. So that was like, it was like, oh, it's really tough to judge like what this is going to look like or whatnot. So that's where, you know, that's what was my thinking was at the time of that move. I think, you know, it's not even controversial for anybody at this point that like that the move hasn't really moved the needle. Like I think you could technically say the team has gotten worse just because of the strong start they had and the lack of success they've seen recently. But I don't, you know, that's not on Rex's fault or anything in my opinion. Like it's just whatever was leading to success early on that hasn't been there post roster change. So I think, yeah, it's you know, I probably wouldn't go as far as saying they're the worst team in the league, just because of, you know, they have had some success this year with at least the core of this squad. But I do think, you know, we did our power rankings and everything for champs. They are definitely one of the teams that I'm expecting to exit champs with most likely a top 8 finish and losing 2 series back to back, just based on what we've seen from them lately. I don't have high expectations for the squad. I think, you know, I don't have the records in front of me, but I know, you know, you kind of just mentioned it in passing, like Carolina's thing earlier this year when they were doing well was search and destroy. And I do remember there was a time at the very start of the year where Toronto was like the top S&D team. It might have only been for like the Major 1 qualifiers and Major 1 itself, but there was a time where it was Toronto at the top before like FaZe and Miami kicked into gear in search. So even like Carolina's, you know, you can say quote unquote strong suit is not in a favorable spot. And matchup wise, again, it's not like, you know, Carolina's a good search team playing against a bad search team. They're a good search team, or at least they have been able to win searches earlier this year, and they're playing against another team that has had success in search. And I think most people would say Toronto's the better team in respawn. So matchup wise, in terms of the game modes, it's a tough draw there. I just think Toronto's the better team right now. The one thing I will say though is that, you know, matchup wise for these two squads, it's a 1-3 record for Carolina, and their one win came at Major One, which means that Carolina, it was with a different roster, but Carolina has beaten Toronto on land. I think that's just, there were all of the Gwinternet stuff earlier this year and whatnot. So the fact that Carolina has a land win against this squad on Toronto earlier this year, at least again, going back to the Boston LAT thing, like it's in the back of their minds, at least 3/4 of the squad know they can do it. They can beat these guys. It's just going to have to be like, they really had to have hit the ground really strong over these last couple weeks and during the break and trying to fine tune all their mistakes and whatnot. And I really do think, we talk a lot, like you said, about Super Saiyan Real and all that stuff. I think we need a Super Saiyan Gwyn performance here if Carolina is to have any hope of advancing in the winners bracket. We don't, what I'm about to say is speculative because we don't, have the contract information and stuff in front of us, but everything we seemingly know about contracts in previous years, like that 1+1 deal is what players initially signed. So you imagine that Gwyn is technically a free agent after this year, even though he's only been with Carolina. So that's an interesting situation. Is this like, Gwyn's last chance to show what he's capable of? Has he done enough for Carolina to make them want to continue to build around him? Is he going to get offers from other teams, et cetera, et cetera? So that's a whole nother element to it. And a strong showing for Gwyn at Champs can bode well for him, regardless of whether he's on Carolina or, getting offers from other teams and whatnot. So, I just think end of the day, Carolina hasn't been playing well lately. I think very highly of Toronto. Well, I shouldn't say very highly, but we did the power rankings and whatnot. I just think, Toronto has the potentials there when the matchups are favorable to cause some damage. And this is a very favorable matchup for them. So I'm definitely taking Toronto here.
Yeah, with Gwyn, he also has rightfully, wrongfully, whatever, this kind of reputation among some people that he doesn't show up on land nearly to the same degree that he shows up online. And if he has, let's say, a bad event, or not even a bad event, he just doesn't have a very good event, he drops like a 1.0 KD or something, and they lose in this match, and maybe they get double first rounded, which is a pretty likely outcome for how this team has played over the last few weeks. I wonder how that changes, like where his free agency goes, like how many teams are interested. Let's say like the same result, but he performs very well and Carolina still doesn't do well, versus him not performing well, Carolina gets eliminated. I think that really does change the opinion on him going into this offseason, and how many teams might be interested in him. But I wanted to talk about Carolina in particular because I've been very honest, very open about Toronto, how I just don't see it. I don't see like a championship quality in this team. I think they have really good players. It just doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't really seem to click. And there isn't like the LAT or the Atlanta FaZe quality to them, or even at their best, not the Vancouver Surge's kind of quality, or in the best outcome, Optic Texas as well. But Carolina, so before the roster change, this was with Vivid, the rest of the season, for the first 80 or so odd % of this season, like you said, they were a very good S&D team, a little inconsistent at times, but overall a very strong S&D team. 25-14 in search. They were a decent hardpoint team, a little bit over 500, 27-24. And then control, they were just below 500, 15-16 on the season. Then they make this roster change. They bring in Rex to replace Vivid. Their S&D, which again, I'll remind you, it was 25-14 in search. They are 3-7 in search since Rex came into the roster. Hardpoint, like I said, they were a little over 500, 27-24 in hardpoint, 2-11 in hardpoint.
Yeah.
Since he came in, they're 3-6, so even the control has gone down. They're 1-8 in their 9 matches with Vivid. The caveat,
With Rex.
excuse me, with Rex. So it was the last match of the Major 3 qualifiers, Major 3, and then all of Major 4 qualifiers and Major 4. So 1-8 in that time. I will say, though, I will give them an excuse because I think it is at least worth noting. So, like you mentioned, their first 2 matches with Rex against LAT, who we talked about, like, even at the time, we said these matches, like, the results of these matches do not matter even one little bit to, like, the future of Carolina because unless they perform very well, of course. But if they get steamrolled by LAT in those first 2 matches, we both said it doesn't matter because they got steamrolled the 5 or 6 times they played them before Rex came in the lineup. So we kind of expect that. They get steamrolled. It was arguably a little bit worse than we even kind of expected at the time. It was very, very dominant, one-sided affair in favor of LAT. Then they play Minnesota. Minnesota, was a champs fringe team. Of course, they brought in Kenny later in the season. They did start to have some success, but was pretty inconsistent overall. Carolina loses 3-1 to Minnesota. They play Toronto, of course, their champs opponent. They lose 3-1 to Toronto. Then they play Boston. That is their one win since Rex has come into this lineup. They swept Boston on May 3rd. So it's been a while for them since their last win. Then they get 3-0'd by Optic. They lose again to Minnesota 3-1. They get swept by Miami 3-0. And then in the last match of their season, they lose to the Toronto Ultra 3-2. So, back-to-back matches for these two teams, or I guess Toronto's played since then. But for Carolina, they've been able to kind of just focus on Toronto for a long time now and been able to probably look at that match in particular and try to figure out what went wrong in that match. I will note, though, Toronto twice. Again, like I said, they placed 3rd in the regular season. Miami, probably the 3rd or 4th best team at the end of the season with everything. Optic, we talked about it, like they are very inconsistent, but at their best, they could be a championship contender. Like at their very, very best, they're a championship contender. And then they lost to Toronto again. And of course, LAT is a championship contender, if not like one of, certainly one of the top 2, maybe the favorite to win champs. So let's say 5 of those losses maybe are to 3 or 4 of the top teams in the league. I think that's an excuse to make for them. I'm sure they won't make that excuse, but at the same point, like it might be something to point out, and maybe their 1-8 record isn't as bad as it would seemingly indicate, right? Like if you go 1-8, everybody probably says, "Oh, you really, really stink." Maybe they're not that bad, but we just haven't seen them against Vegas, LAG, some of those bottom teams, C9, to really get a gauge on if they're playing better than those teams. Like an Optic situation we saw earlier this season where they actually did lose to Vegas, they did lose to LAG, and we did think that they were just as bad, if not worse, than those teams. I'm still going to go with Toronto. I can't pick Carolina at this point in time. If this was Major 1, Major 2, yes, you could definitely talk me into Carolina. I might not have picked them. I don't remember exactly what I felt or how I felt about Toronto in relation to Carolina or vice versa at that point in the season. But right now, Toronto, even if I don't believe that they're a true championship contender, Carolina is a really good contender to be double first rounded at champs. And, that's just the unfortunate reality right now that we're living in. The last match that we have to talk about is the biggest match of the first round by far. It will get the most viewers, undoubtedly. There will be a lot of anticipation for this match in particular. It is Optic Texas versus Atlanta FaZe. It is the final match on Thursday. It is the grand finale of Winners Round 1. They scheduled it at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. That is tentative, obviously, because the matches before it might take too long or might be very quick. We might get a DoorDash special throughout, and then it could start at like 6, right? It could start very, very early compared to the scheduled time, but it is scheduled to be the final match on Thursday. I think this is the I think if if Vancouver performs up to their potential and Miami does, that could be the most interesting matchup. But going into it, Atlanta versus Optic probably is the most interesting matchup because we've seen more recently what Optic can do. They finished top four at their at Major Four. It's their first time finishing top four this season after winning champs a year ago. It was also the first event that Mercules competed in with Optic after joining during the Major Four qualifiers. Atlanta FaZe, they went to 3 grand finals this season. They won 2 of them. They lose to LA Thieves in the grand finals of Major Four. They, if you want to go back and listen to it, our Legacy Check podcast, we talked extensively about most of these players on Atlanta FaZe because Simp and Abizi have 2 championships. Another champs ring puts them in that very elite class of 3 world championship rings, and it definitely brings them into the GOAT conversation. If Simp is probably kind of, in my opinion, approaching that anyway, but certainly with accolades, winning 3 championships would do a lot for their legacy. Same for Celium. Draza would also get 2. It would be a very momentous occasion for Atlanta FaZe, and it would shut up people, at least for a little bit, with the Silver Surfer stuff. As for Optic, they are attempting to become the first team ever to win back-to-back championships, even with different roster. No brand has won the championship in consecutive years. Optic could be the first in 2024 and 2025. Mercules, I mean, if he wins a championship in his third event ever, or third CDL event ever, and his second event with Optic, he's only been on the team for like 7 weeks total. I think that would be an incredible story. Optic in general, Shotzi would also be elevated into GOAT conversation, considering he would also have 3 championships. We talked about Dashi, how much his legacy could use it, and Hook probably has the most interesting legacy talk of them all if he wins another championship. What are you thinking about going into this matchup, considering we did see this match pretty recently, and Atlanta has been rather dominant? Even if some of the matches have been close, they have not lost to Optic in a pretty long time.
Yeah, I think this is definitely, anybody who's listened to our episodes over the last couple of weeks while we've been filling the gap in the break and whatnot. I know I said it at least once. I feel like I probably said it a couple times. Despite this being a 2-7 matchup, and despite like the numbers suggesting FaZe have had Optics number this year, et cetera, like this is a really interesting matchup on paper. Just, not even solely because it's brand power with Optic and FaZe, right? Like it's just, we've seen other occasions where, it's kind of ironic what I'm about to say because, at least when we were talking about the old Optic rosters in previous years and stuff, the one narrative around them was sometimes they came out slow to start tournaments, and that kind of put their backs against the wall early on, and then the team was just so good it didn't matter. But other times it did end up mattering, and that's when they had some of their lackluster, quote unquote, lackluster performances in comparison to all their great accolades and whatnot. But that's sort of just, it's weird to say it, but for FaZe, like the lingering thought for them just has to be like, we can't have a repeat performance of last year's champs where things just did not go according to plan. And, I said it last episode too, like, the FaZe roster, because of that champs performance last year, it felt like, at least from the outside looking in, there could have been more roster change talk if they hadn't won the Esports World Cup following champs last year. So, a 2-7 matchup in terms of seeding, this is one where you have like those the 2-7s in March Madness where maybe like the 2 seed is not the super name brand, and then like the 7 seed your Duke, your UNC or something like that, and it's like, you're filling out your bracket and it's like, okay, I'm gonna go with the 7 here. not that I didn't mean that in the sense that I don't think FaZe are good, but I just feel like, for a 2-7 matchup, that this is got to be a little more interesting than I guess, let's just say like LAT, the 1-8, where even though Boston have beaten LAT this year, like it feels like LAT should be able to take care of business against Boston. And I do think, end of the day too, I think Atlanta should win this series. They have beaten Optic uh, 4 times this year, and they have beaten Optic with Mercules in the roster. It's only been once, but it's not like the Vancouver Miami situation where they had those two rosters haven't played. So yeah, this is an exciting matchup, and we've talked historically over the years for some of like the qualifiers and stuff about how the last match of a day in the qualifiers should always be the banger, and sometimes they like throw like these non-interesting matches at the end of the day to just wrap things up. But no, this is a case here where most people are going to want to stay tuned in and watch this matchup. This is one you got circled on the calendar. If you got time to only watch one match on Thursday, like this is the one you're probably going to want to watch. And it very well could be a situation where FaZe just come out and 3-0 sweep. But I think even in a situation where FaZe does 3-0 sweep, like I feel like all the maps are going to be competitive. They maybe the search isn't the closest, just because I still think FaZe are a really good search team, and obviously for a newer roster like Optic, they might not have had as much time to put into that mode in particular. But yeah, even in a world where this is a 3-0 for Atlanta, I could see it being like 250, 200 in the hard point, a 6-4, 6-5 in the search, and then a 3-2 in the control. 3-2 in the controls, not really anything to scoff at though, because I bet like 80% of controls go to round 5. But yeah, I'm really excited for this one. I think it's really it sets the tone for both teams, right? Like Atlanta comes out, gets a win, like people already start to forget about last year, and they're just like, okay, like it's like a check mark, like yeah, okay, they're on to winners round 2, like maybe Atlanta, we get another taste of Atlanta versus LAT. That'd be cool. And if Optic pull off this upset in round 1, people are starting to talk about what you're saying. Like, okay, are they really going to get this done? Like back to back, Mercules first championship at Champs. Like Dashy gets a second ring, Shotzi getting a third ring, Hoot getting a second ring. Like, so a lot of stuff to look at with this one. I am really excited about it, but I do think in the end, FaZe should get the job done.
I don't think it's going to happen, but something you said earlier about Boston versus LAT is like, or something you said something similar, and I thought about this. It's kind of like a trap game in college football where these big powerhouses, Georgia schedules Jacksonville State or something one week, and they just expect it to kind of be a tune-up before they play Florida or Alabama the next weekend. And sometimes that comes back to bite them. And the team that you weren't expecting to be competitive is much, much more competitive than you could have imagined. And sometimes those teams lose those games. I think LAT losing to Boston in Major 2 is something similar, because I believe they were going to play like Vancouver in round 2 or something like that. That was kind of projected, but they had like what we thought was going to be a really interesting second round matchup. And of course it doesn't come to fruition because they lose in round 1. I think there's a chance that happens in LAT versus Boston this time around. I think it's a pretty small chance. And there's also a chance that happens here with Atlanta and Optic. The dynamic is different, right? Because there is such a big gap between LAT at their best and Boston at their best. There is a gap between Atlanta at their best and Optic at their best, or what we've seen to be their best so far with Mercules. But I still think like that's a much, much closer gap, or a much smaller gap than LAT and Boston. So if Atlanta kind of takes this for granted, and I'm not saying they will, but if they took it for granted and said, we have their number, we don't lose to these guys anymore. Like we didn't lose to them for a long time. And then there was like a 2-year stretch where we just lost to them all the time. And then it's been 2 years basically where we just been beating the hell out of them. Yeah. It's been a Draza show basically. Like Draza has this ridiculous record against Optic. And I just looked it up while you were talking. So their Atlanta FaZe's record now over the last 2 years, so the 2024 season and this 2025 season, and that's including EWC. Atlanta is 11-1 against Optic over those 2 years. So Draza had this pretty good record against Optic when he was LAT. That is continued with Atlanta FaZe. And to win 11 of 12 matches against anybody, but particularly a team that won champs last year, has probably this year is probably not the greatest indication, but they just beat them not too long ago in the qualifiers, or not the qualifiers, at Major 4. So we've seen it recently. We've seen it throughout the season. We saw it last year, even when Optic was in general a much better team, and Atlanta still won. That makes me think that there is a possibility, there is some kind of alternate universe where Atlanta FaZe does take for granted this match and start thinking more about this overall goal of, we're going to go and win champs. We're going to get to the grand finals. We're probably going to play LAT, and we're going to avenge that Major 4 loss. And we're going to, get either our second or our third rings respectively. I just don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's at least something to bring up. Atlanta has won 5 straight matches against Atlanta FaZe. Like you said, they're 4-0 against Optic this year, dating back to, I believe, EWC. They beat them. Even technically, it was not Atlanta FaZe and Optic Texas. It was like FaZe Clan versus Optic Gaming, but we know what the deal is there. At the same point, like it is pretty interesting to think about that Optic has just not been able to beat this team at all over the last 2 years. But maybe that changes here, because we saw Optic go into champs last year, and we thought, that they were very talented, but that they were in disarray, that they wouldn't be able to bounce back and kind of find the success that they did. And then they end up winning champs, and it kind of erases all that doubt. It kind of makes all of the doubt look really silly in retrospect. So I'm going to go with Atlanta. I think our stances are pretty clear on the top 2 teams this year, and it's very hard to pick against either one of them unless they're playing each other. And Optic, as much as I do think they could be a real kind of spoiler in this event, because they are the 7th seed. If you're just looking at how they played during the regular season, you would probably not get any indication that they're a very good team, or like at least a good enough team to compete for a championship. But I do believe that the talent on that team is pretty immense, and they probably could win the championship if things click into place at champs. Any other? I guess we should talk about just in general the tournament. So we've gone chalk this entire time, and I mean that does not bode well for this champs bracket, because I think we did that like the first two majors this season, and the first seed lost in both of those, and everything got screwed up. So condolences to the Thieves in this scenario. Where do you see this bracket going? So we both think that it'll be LAT Miami in the top part of the bracket, and that'll be Atlanta versus Toronto in the bottom part. Where do you see the bracket going from there? And obviously the end question would be, who do you think ultimately wins champs 2025?
Yeah, I'll get there in a second. I do think, just in tradition of what we usually do for the preview shows, talking about the potential losers bracket stuff, makes a little bit of sense here. And looking at the champs bracket from last year, I'm pretty sure, at least for the first round, it just drops straight down from winner's bracket round 1 to loser bracket round 1. So the loser of the top 2 matches in the bracket would play in that first loser bracket, and then the second quadrant, those 2 losers would play below that.
I believe so.
And then for the second round, winners bracket round 2, it would switch. So then like LAT versus Miami, the loser of LAT Miami would play in the lower loser bracket matchup, as opposed to dropping down to the top. So, just playing theoretically here, like, Boston versus Vancouver in the losers bracket there. If Vancouver beats Boston, they would potentially play, at least according to our predictions, the loser of FaZe versus Toronto, which that could be interesting. At the same time, though, then you have like Optic versus Carolina. That would mean, again, this is hypothetical, but if Optic beats Carolina, then they are playing the loser of a potential LAT versus Miami matchup, and that's got to be scary for the Green Wall,
Yeah, for
because
sure.
if that is what happens, like either of those teams is a tough matchup um, for Optic, regardless of who it actually is. So I do think that's just interesting to get out of the way and talk about. I do think though at the end of the day, like we've kind of teed up here, like the way we have chalk for our first round picks. It would drop down Boston versus Vancouver. I think we would both lean Vancouver. Maybe you're going with your Boston boy, so I won't speak for you there. But then in a world where it's Optic and Carolina below that, it would probably be us both picking Optic over Carolina, and that would give us Carolina and Boston in the top 8. And then from there, really, I mean, we're already in enough hypotheticals, so it's tough to go beyond that from the losers bracket. But um, it just feels, and it's probably a result of it only being an 18 tournament, but
Yeah.
it feels a little harder to like kind of map out a road for a team to go on a losers bracket run, at least based on our predictions. Like again, if LAT somehow get upset by Boston round 1, I think we're both thinking like LAT has the potential to obviously go on a strong losers bracket run. But based on what we're thinking so far for these matchups and whatnot, it seems pretty hard for me to map out like a losers bracket round 1 to COD Champs 2025 victor, sort of deal there.
Yeah, I was trying to think of like who's the most likely of those 4 teams that we think are going to lose winners round 1. Like who's the most likely, taking into account what the bracket would
Yeah,
look like. It might be Optic, like just
it has to be,
yeah.
because I can't as of right now, June 22nd, like I can't go with Vancouver, because literally the last time
Yeah.
I said this was Major 4, because they had that first round matchup against LAT, I believe, at Major 4, and I was like, oh, they dropped down and play Vegas. Like, I can see that being the matchup. Even if Vancouver loses round 1 in the winners bracket, they drop down, play Vegas, they can start and heat up from there, and then they lost to Vegas. So I can't go with Vancouver of those 4 teams, even though I think like mapping it out with the bracket, especially considering like Optic, if they were to lose, then beat Carolina and then have to play an LAT or Miami. I think that's a tougher matchup than if Vancouver beats Boston and then Vancouver has to play Toronto. But yeah, it's tough to. I can't go with Boston or Carolina, and
No.
Vancouver just weird spot. Don't know what to expect from them. Maybe it changes after I see them play their first map. But yeah, as of now, like you got to go with Optic of those 4 teams that we have in theory losing in the first round.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was just trying to debate in my head about Vancouver versus
Yeah.
Optic. Like Vancouver has shown us at their best, like that they could make this kind of
Yeah.
run. But you're right. Like the current Vancouver, I guess the most recent Vancouver that we saw does not give any indication that they could do that and that they could win 4 matches, to make it to grand finals. So, and I think we should also mention that like if you lose in round 1, like it is 1 match less to make it to grand finals in this tournament versus a major, which obviously would be 5. But yeah, it's probably Optic. Like Optic beating Carolina seems pretty likely if they were both to drop down to losers bracket, and then probably play Miami if I had to guess. Miami or Vancouver, depending on who wins in round 2, or round 1, because I think LAT is probably going to win that one as well. So, but that would be kind of the luck of the draw. Like that has happened multiple times before, where we might think, well, it's going to work out. Where Optic plays this kind of so-so team in the first round, they might even play like a kind of flawed team in the second round. Who knows how this will go? Like Toronto very well could lose round 1. And let's say Optic loses round 1, like then Optic versus Toronto, one of them goes home on day 2. And then, round 2, even if they didn't play Toronto in the first round, Optic realistically could play LAT in the second round of the losers bracket if Miami is able to upset the Thieves, which they have done previously on land. So like those things happen. we also could just see FaZe in the losers bracket round one, and they have to kind of fight their entire way through losers bracket, which would be very interesting. And I think their legacies would be at stake in the general eye of the community, not necessarily on the Ego Chall podcast, but I think there would be a lot of people throwing a lot of shade at Atlanta FaZe if they lose the optic round one and are in the losers bracket immediately.
And I mean, I'm just looking because I was looking for the losers bracket, but like just as a general reminder how last year's champs went, like we've talked about it for FaZe in particular, but like FaZe won round one against Miami 3-1. Then they lose to New York, winners bracket round two, 3-2. And then they lose 3-0 to Toronto and scrap in the famous Battle of the Girlfriends or whatever.
Yeah.
But like, so Atlanta won their first round matchup, and then they lose their next two and just get top 6 at champs because that's how champs works. Like it's just, smaller sample size and it's just your 2 series and you're done. So it's like, even in a world where FaZe wins a first round matchup or any of these teams, really, like nobody's safe just because it's do or die time. And I'm pretty sure if I had to check both of those, the New York and Toronto losses for Atlanta, I'm pretty sure they were on the same day. So it's like, and the thing in COD is like any given day, Team A can beat Team B and Team B can beat Team A sort of deal. Like, you got to be on your A game here going into champs.
Yeah, there's probably only going into this event, let's say Vancouver is able to kind of get back even remotely close to where they were in Major 2 and Major 3, there are really only 2 teams that don't seem competitive at all going into this event. And that, maybe I'm not saying any 6 of those teams could realistically win champs, but all 6 of those teams could get top 3, could probably make it to the grand finals. Like there isn't some kind of barrier to entry for Toronto, even if I don't think that they're like a championship team. They could get top 3, top 4. They could make it to Championship Sunday. I don't know if that's like super likely, but I would say it's like at worst like a 25% chance, 30% chance that they make it to Championship Sunday. The same for Vancouver or Miami. Of course, LAT and Atlanta are those teams that we expect them to be there. But I think that's just a testament out to how competitive and how small this league is. Like the downside of expansion is it dilutes all of these teams, right? If we had 25 teams in this league and half of them made champs, those teams in general would be worse. They would have less talent stacked onto these teams. We only have 12 teams in the CDL, so it's a very stacked roster pretty much anywhere you look. Even the teams that we don't think are the most impressive rosters in general are able to pull off, like what you just said, any given day they're able to beat these top teams. And I would almost, I'm not going to bet on it obviously, but I would almost bet that one of these teams that we picked to win is losing in round one, because that's how things work. Like it's not a likely outcome. Like I don't know what the exact odds are, but it's not likely that Toronto, Atlanta, Miami, and LA Thieves all win their first round matchup. It's just not that likely.
I just, Vancouver the 4 seed or the 5 seed? I'm trying to.
I believe they're the
regular
4.
season. Vancouver's the 4, so I guess technically it's not the equivalent of like all favorites winning with our picks, but like,
spiritually,
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 5 is what we're picking. I'm not gonna go out. I'll circle back to your original question before I started talking about the losers bracket. I'm not gonna go out and say like I think something crazy is gonna happen in the first round. Like obviously it could. I feel pretty confident about these early picks, but I think like you asking to look beyond that, like when we get beyond these chalk matchups, if this first round plays out the way we expect it to, then Thieves versus Miami, super interesting matchup. And I really think like, it could go either way, but just the way LAT have been playing, I expect them to win that. And then on the other side, it would be Toronto versus Atlanta. I would give the edge to FaZe there. And then we would have FaZe versus LAT again. It feels like that's just too easy.
Yeah.
And like, so like saying this out loud and saying like, again, I don't think something nutty, it wouldn't be unpredictable if I was able to predict it right now. but there is something in my gut, and I guess I'll get to that when we're doing like our final winner or whatever. Just I don't know what it's going to be, but there is going to be that like champ surprise, and something's going to happen because it just feels like it's way too simple the way we're breaking it down in terms of like, oh, it feels like all roads leading to another LAT versus FaZe showdown, and then rematch in the finals after that. Like I honestly I hope that's what we get because I've loved those matchups previously this year. It would be cool to see it again. The two teams with two titles this year fighting for the right to be called the best team in Black Ops 6. But I don't know what it's going to be. I just, something is going to happen that throws a wrench in all this.
Let's get to that championship though, because we have like really, really good teams, but there are two teams that stand out above the rest for what we've seen this season. We only got two championship winners this entire season, even if you include the online events, which I don't think we brought up until now. But there were two teams that won two majors, and there was a team that won one minor and another team that won one minor. The same two teams this entire season have won everything there is to win, and that's LA Thieves and Atlanta FaZe. They're on opposite sides of the bracket, so the earliest that they could play each other is really winners finals. Technically they could face each other in losers bracket, but I think it's pretty unlikely that they both would find each other in losers bracket that early. But that might be something, where something crazy happens, like you just said, and we see some kind of unprecedented upset with the two top teams. That being said, I think one of us is probably going to pick LAT. One of us is probably going to pick FaZe. I would like to get ahead of it. I'm going to pick LAT. I'm fully expecting to be wrong because I've been wrong on 4 majors this season, even though I picked LAT or FaZe this entire season. Yep. You picked LAT or FaZe this entire season and gotten all 4 of them right. So by that logic, congratulations to Atlanta FaZe on their world championship. So I'm going to go with LAT.
And I will take FaZe and, in terms of strictly picking the opposite of you, so it's not just a super boring show. But the way I'm feeling right now, gun to my head, and I always say it, like, if I'm thinking with my head, I got to pick LAT to win this event. If I'm picking with my heart, it feels like FaZe are going to find a way to get it done and get back to where they were earlier this season with beating LAT. I can only hope we get another. Was it 9? Yeah, it was a best of 9 last year because Optic Texas won 5-1 against New York. So give me a game 9 round 11 this time to build off that game 7 round 11 for major 1. I'll be super happy. But yeah, with my head, LAT, my heart, FaZe, and my gut, I really like. I would not, even if I did bet on this stuff, I would not put any money on it. But my gut is telling me there's something's gonna happen where it's throwing that wrench in here, and we're talking all this LAT versus FaZe stuff, and like some other team. It could be Miami. It could be Optic. It could be Vancouver. I would be surprised if it was Toronto. I'd be surprised if it was. I'm not going to say I'd be surprised if it was Toronto because it is maybe they got. We talked about this last time and joked about the Texas home field advantage last year that people were saying. Now it's the Canada home field cheese potential for Toronto. So that's there. I'd be really surprised if it was Boston or Carolina. But outside of those two, for the other 4 teams that aren't FaZe or LAT, I feel like something's going to happen where it's like a FaZe versus one of those other 4 or an LAT versus one of those other 4. I just can't put my nose on where it's going to happen. And that's what makes me think, I'm going back and forth like ping pong in my head. Like the fact that I can't pick out where that potentially could be that like super wrench or just, whatever that messes things up, the upset, your St. Peter's from other years or whatever. The fact that I can't pick that out makes it feel like this is like, one of those years where it's all 4 1 seeds going to the Final Four in college basketball and 1 versus 1 in the finals, and we do get LAT versus FaZe. But yeah, I hope it's the case where we get LAT versus FaZe, and honestly, I would be really happy for either of those teams getting it done. For LAT, it would be Scrap's first ring. That would be, especially in anticipation of him seemingly going to win MVP. this year could potentially cap off one of the greatest years in competitive Call of Duty history. And if you don't want to go that far, probably one of the greatest years in CDL history is definitely up there for debate. Then Hydra, furthering his legacy, Ghosty getting his first ring, Envoy his second. They complete a three-peat, which we talked about earlier this year. It'd be a three-peat on the same game as opposed to where the EWC in the first two events this year for FaZe was on two different games. But then conversely, you got FaZe, if they do get this, it's they won the first two events. After that, they fall back a little bit, but then they're able to climb back up and hoist another one. So I do think they're great storylines for both of these top teams. And I really, in terms of what it will mean for the Ego Chall podcast and what we had to talk about, there's going to be plenty for us to talk about, regardless of if either of those two teams win. And truthfully, if a team other than those two win, potentially even more for us to talk about. But I do think the script is potentially there for, a fairy tale ending for both of those two teams if they are able to get the job done.
We're doing a 4-hour podcast if Boston Breach win. Just letting you know. We might just pull an all-nighter. We're going to be taking shots, talking about the Boston Breach. We're going to go through map by map.
Dark Sensor Martin gets a ring.
Yeah. Snoopy has to go fly to Slasher's house and punch him in the face, I think. This should be agreed upon. But yeah, I think what you said is completely correct. The storylines are plentiful for pretty much any team that wins this, and that's just how it is with champs. I think people could say, well, it's kind of boring if the best team always wins it or whatever, but that's just kind of how things go. And the best thing, or the best team, is kind of subjective right now. I think it would be kind of foolish to say it's anybody other than LAT or FaZe, but I think it's probably 50-50 if you polled people, said who's the best. There's probably going to be a little bit heavily more in favor than with LAT because they just won, they just beat FaZe. But it's not overwhelming. They're not the undoubted favorite or anything like that. And I think that's good. I think that's what the CDL needs a lot of times. It's the parity, even if it is parity between just a few of the top teams. There's only 12 teams in this league, so 3 teams or 4 teams winning an event in a year, which has happened before, that is pretty unusual. There's really not a professional traditional sports equivalent to basically a fourth of the league just being as competitive as everybody else. That just doesn't really happen all that much. But yeah, I'm gonna go with LAT. I think they're right now, it's hard to pick against them. They just beat FaZe, but I might change my pick once we get to the grand finals, once we get through the bracket, because that's happened before too. Sometimes I just think, well, it just looks like FaZe has it right now and LAT doesn't. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm very excited for this weekend. I believe it's going to be a great event. I very much believe that it is not going to be as straightforward as we predicted it to be, because that is not how things go in the Ego Chall podcast world. But we'll see what happens. It starts on Thursday. It runs until Sunday. Again, matches start, I believe, at 3 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, starting on YouTube. So you can check it out there, the live stream. And basically the matches will run all day, all weekend. And it's going to be, I think, a lot of fun. There are going to be some pretty crazy moments, I'm sure. There's probably going to be some trash talk, especially if FaZe and LAT play each other again. We might get some camera cuts to their respective girlfriends again, which I don't advise, but I'm definitely not going to browbeat anyone for enjoying that. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. We'll talk about champs after the weekend and kind of recap what just happened at the biggest event of the year. Our pick'em, I should say, before we get out of here, though, we are completely deadlock tied in pick'em this season. We have gone through 4 majors and 2 minors. That is 240-ish matches. I think 238, if my math is correct here. 238 matches, and we are completely tied through 238 matches. 158 and 80 for both of us. I don't know what to expect because I believe we were very close last year, and
We were.
champs grand finals, I believe, was the divider between the two of us.
And
So
I picked to make sure that it wasn't a tie because I'm not going out with a tie. So
Yeah.
I expect the same professional courtesy from you this year if we are in that situation heading into the last match.
well, okay, if it's FaZe versus Boston Breach, like I'll just go Boston just to make sure. But yeah, that does it for us. We appreciate, obviously, we're coming toward the end of the season. The next time that we talk to you, the CDL season won't be active. I do not consider EWC to be part of the CDL season. You can fight me all you want, but the CDL season ends, as far as I'm concerned, on Sunday, and we will be back to talk about it then. Thank you for listening and watching. Make sure to subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as YouTube. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've had daily videos there, a lot of breakout videos over the past 2 weeks or so, I believe. I saw there was quite a bit of love on the episode about us talking about CDL champs not being promoted very well. So if that's something that you're interested in listening or watching, please go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. I think we're at 236 subscribers, I believe. I think we added 1 or 2 since last week. But I appreciate you guys following along and being very supportive of us throughout this entire season. And the next time you will talk to us, it will be quasi off-season Ego Chall Podcast. Even though EWC is technically a thing, but I think we'll probably get some roster changes between champs and EWC like last year. So we might have some roster mania to talk about, maybe not on Sunday, but maybe we'll be talking about it over the next few weeks. You can follow us both on Twitter at JBank with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. And again, we will be back this weekend to wrap up champs and wrap up the 2025 CDL season. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Hope you enjoyed the preview show and had as much fun with us this whole season as we've had. Just real quick on that roster front, like you're saying, like, obviously Game 7 of NBA Finals is going on right now as we're recording, and less than 12-ish hours ago today, Kevin Durant got traded to the Rockets. So, obviously people like to make the esports and sports comparison. So maybe we will have some roster changes to talk about, but I don't think that will be the case like Preston. I think that'll probably wait until after champs, but who knows? Maybe Cloud9 swoops in and makes a move for somebody on Championship Sunday, and then that gets the COD community buzzing even before the grand finals, which should be exciting on its own. So, yeah, thanks for all the support. Appreciate all you guys tuning in. Shout out Noah. Again, the YouTube chat showing love. And yeah, hope you enjoy champs and hope you tune in and are ready to join us back here when we're breaking it all down this weekend and to the couple weeks to follow before UWC. So thank you guys. And remember to send the chow.